Mr. President, we would like to thank the Special Coordinator for the Middle East Peace Process, Tor Vannesland, and the head of the United Nations Truth Supervision Organization mission, Mr. Gosha. We thank them for the overview of the situation in the occupied Palestinian territories, where for 2.5 months we have been witnessing an unprecedented in the number of victims massacre. Since the last meeting on the Council on this issue on the 8th of December, 10 days have elapsed, and the number of its victims in this time has grown further. To date, since the beginning of the Israeli military operation in Gaza, about 19,000 people lost their lives. 70% of them are women and children. 90% of the Gaza population, about 2 million people, have become internally displaced. The victims of indiscriminate Israeli actions is also amongst Israeli hostages. Add to that the total blockade of Gaza, including downed comms, harsh restrictions on humanitarian aid supplies. There is an acute shortage in the strip of water, fuel, medicines, and the civic order, and on the brink of collapse. WHO Director General Tedros Adhanom confirms that no one is safe in Gaza. Out of 36 medical facilities, until recently, only 8 functioned partially, but they didn't have water or electricity. There is an illustration also here through the number of staff killed. The ICRC and UN staff were killed together with their families, including babies. Under attack, including repeated attack, are about 90 UN facilities. 133 staff of the organization were killed. And this, according to the UN data, is the largest single loss the U.S. has ever suffered. The head of OCHA, Martin Griffiths, said the disaster in the enclave in the strip is the worst he's ever seen, especially taking into account that people have nowhere to go, and the stated goal of eliminating Hamas cannot be implemented. According to mass media, Israel dropped about 29,000 air bombs on Gaza, which is comparable to the number dropped by the U.S. and UK throughout their entire military aggression in Iraq in 2003. We have received shocking news from the Latin Patriarchate in Jerusalem on the 16th of December during the Holy Family festivities in church, which was a refuge for many families. An Israeli sniper killed 2 Christians. 7 more people were wounded as they tried to protect their loved ones. According to witness account, there were no warnings issued to that. On the same day, Israel had an airstrike against the monastery of Mother Teresa, which was marked as a shelter since the beginning of the escalation. And such attacks continue at the time when everyone is preparing for the Christmas celebrations on the 25th of December. Mr. President, against the background of disaster in Gaza, what we have somewhat in the background in the news is what is happening in the West Bank, whereas violence rages there as well. There are continued armed raids by Israel and brutal attacks by Israeli settlers. As a result of an Israeli incursion into Nur Shams camp, 5 Palestinians were killed in the last 24 hours, and the day before, another Palestinian was killed in the Farah camp. Therefore, since the 7th of October, the overall number of victims of the so-called Israeli operations in the West Bank is at least 293 people. And in this context, we'd like to underscore the fact that the clearing of the West Bank is something that Israel has been doing for a long time, even before 7th October. And then there was no link with terror threats or security issues, which is a slogan that the West of Jerusalem is using for its unprecedented in scope operation in Gaza. In parallel to that, in the West Bank, there's a demolition of Palestinian houses without construction permits, and it's virtually impossible to receive such a permit. There is also a continued settlement policy prosecuted by the Western Jerusalem, including funding for the expanded settlements. Such plans are being approved by the Israeli authorities in parallel with the planned destruction of Gaza. Mr. President, the scope of humanitarian disaster in the area of conflict compelled the Secretary General to invoke his powers under Article 99 of the Charter and call on the Council to pass a decision on ending the bloodbath. But despite the efforts made by the absolute majority of Security Council members, all of the drafts submitted were blocked by Washington. Washington, instead of helping civilians, is providing Israel massively with all kinds of weapons which are used to kill Palestinian civilians. Currently, everyone should understand that the stalling of collective UN efforts is not a result of some kind of objective institutional issues, but rather as a result of stubborn and egotistical ambitions on the part of American leadership. It will not be an exaggeration to say that there is a consensus in the world about the need to have an immediate humanitarian ceasefire in Gaza. And the only state besides Israel which stands against this, pitting themselves against the entire international community, is the United States. After the tragic events on the 7th of October, the policy of Washington in the region has reached a strategic impasse. The Hamas raid, for which there is no and cannot be a justification, cannot be considered separately for what Israel is doing to construct and expand settlements on Palestinian territories, or separate from the failed policy by the U.S. aimed at ignoring the Palestinian issue, ignoring the aspirations for their own state, and their work to undermine the international basis for the Middle East settlement, including the two-state solution. With Washington's assist, the UN resolutions pledging a state for the Palestinians are being stonewalled by Israel for more than a decade against a background of illegal expansion of settlements and seizing of Palestinians' land and property. This is a background, also the blockade of Gaza, and against this background we have several generations of Gazans grown up against that. Our position has been consistent. We cherish our historically close relationship with the Palestinians and Israelis alike. We condemned any kind of act of terror or an indiscriminate use of force against civilians and civilian infrastructure. We advocate the end of hostilities in Gaza, ensuring the safety of civilians and the release of those detained. At the same time, we're consistent in our advocacy for the creation of an independent and viable Palestinian state within 1967 borders, with the capital in East Jerusalem, coexisting in peace and security with Israel. Our approach is based on the international legal basis for the Middle East settlement, including the resolutions passed by the General Assembly and Security Council. Furthermore, we call for the implementation of the only to-date product that Security Council has on Gaza, Resolution 2712, which, as weak as it is, at least contains a mandatory for implementation appeals to parties to establish humanitarian pauses. There has to be an international monitoring of the implementation of this Security Council decision on the UN aegis. We're grateful to Secretary General for working through the options for this monitoring. We are studying them very closely, and we expect that the Council in the very near future will decide on the option to choose and will pass a decision on that in a resolution. I thank you.